My cousin Saeed, you can't even afford a new car, and you're giving career advice? The whole table laughed. I said nothing. 6 months later, he applied for a job at my company. His resume was fine, but I remembered that night. I scheduled an interview. What happened in that room? He'll never forget. I've never been the type to post my personal shit online, but what happened over the past 6 months has been living rent-free in my head, and I need to get this off my chest. Fair warning, this might be long F. For context, I'm 32 and drive a 2011 Honda Accord with 187K miles on it. Not because I can't afford better, I just don't care about cars. It's reliable, paid off, and gets me where I need to go. My cousin Ramana, 34M, is the complete opposite, always flexing his lifestyle on Instagram, constantly upgrading his possessions, and low-key putting others down if they don't match his standard of success. Look, family gatherings have always been a minefield with Ramon around, but last Thanksgiving at my parents' place took things to a whole new level. I pulled up in my trusty Accord while Ramon rolled in with his brand-new Mercedes, making sure everyone noticed. Whatever, I'm used to his not-so-subtle comparisons by now. Dinner started like always. Too much food, too much wine, and way too many questions about everyone's personal life. My younger cousin, Sergio, 19, mentioned he was thinking about switching his major to computer science and asked if I had any advice since I work in tech. The thing is, I was genuinely happy to help the kid out. I started sharing some thoughts about learning coding languages, building a portfolio on GitHub, and networking strategies that worked for me. Nothing fancy, just honest advice from someone who's been there. That's when Ramon decided to chime in with what he probably thought was the sickest burn of all time. He looked at Sergio, gestured toward me, and said I couldn't even afford a new car. So why would anyone take career advice from me? Then he made some comment about how successful people upgrade their vehicles, not drive them into the ground. The whole fucking table laughed. My Aunt Becky nearly spit out her wine. My mom looked uncomfortable but didn't say anything. Sergio just stared at his plate. And me? I said nothing. Not a goddamn word. I could have told them all about my company, about the 3 rounds of funding we've secured, about our user base growing 200% year over year, about how I could buy Ramon's fancy car with cash 10 times over if I wanted to, but I didn't. Why bother? These people had already decided who I was based on what I drove. The rest of dinner was awkward AF. I stayed just long enough not to make a scene, helped my mom clean up, and bounced. On the drive home in my so-called embarrassing car, I kept replaying that moment. The laughter, the smug look on Ramon's face, the way everyone just accepted his assessment of my worth. For weeks afterward, family members were still texting me asking if I was okay after Ramon just joking around. Funny how no one called him out for being an asshole, but they all had time to check if my feelings were hurt. Classic family dynamics. Then in April, about 5 months after Thanksgiving, my mom called to tell me Ramon had been laid off. Apparently his company had massive cuts, and despite his fancy title, he was one of the first to go. Mom was concerned because he had just bought that Mercedes and moved into a luxury apartment downtown. His Instagram posts suddenly switched from vacation pics to vague inspirational quotes about new beginnings and one door closing. You know the type. I scrolled through his LinkedIn and saw he was open to work and had started aggressively networking. Part of me felt a tiny bit of sympathy. Losing your job sucks, even if you're a dick. But then I remembered Thanksgiving, and that sympathy evaporated like morning dew. Fast forward to early May. I was reviewing applications with our HR director, Danielle, for a senior position we needed to fill ASAP. We had about 30 candidates, and I was skimming through the shortlist when a familiar name jumped out at me. Raman fucking last name. My cousin had applied to my company. The same cousin who had humiliated me in front of our entire family. The same cousin who thought I wasn't successful enough to give career advice because of the car I drove. His resume was fine, good education, decent experience, all the right keywords. If I hadn't known him personally, he would have made it to the interview stage easily. Danielle had already flagged him as a potential fit before passing his application to me. I stared at his application for a solid 20 minutes. The universe has a twisted sense of humor sometimes. Here was Ramon, desperate for a job, unknowingly applying to work for the cousin he had publicly mocked for being unsuccessful. He had no idea I was the founder and CEO. My last name is different from his side of the family, and I've always kept a low profile online. No flashy LinkedIn titles, no press features with my face plastered everywhere. Just focused on building something real while he was focused on appearances. After the initial shock wore off, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time, a sense of perfect clarity. This wasn't just an opportunity for revenge, this was fucking justice being handed to me on a silver platter. I messaged Danielle and told her I wanted to handle this particular candidate personally. She seemed surprised but didn't question it. I asked her to schedule an interview with Ramon, but not to mention my name or position. Just tell him he'd be meeting with a senior team member. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about how Ramon would react when he walked into that interview room and saw me sitting there. Would he try to play it off? Would he apologize? Would he withdraw his application immediately? More importantly, what would I do? The professional thing would be to recuse myself from his hiring process due to our relationship. The ethical thing would be to judge him solely on his qualifications. But as I lay there in the dark, all I could hear was his voice at Thanksgiving. You can't even afford a new car, and you're giving career advice? All I could see were the smirking faces around the table. All I could feel was that burning humiliation. By morning, I knew exactly what I was going to do. Ramon's interview was scheduled for the following Wednesday at 2 p.m. I had 6 days to prepare. 6 days to plan exactly how I would show my dear cousin that the person he had laughed at, the person whose advice he had dismissed, was now the one person standing between him and a paycheck. Sometimes karma needs a little help, and I was more than ready to assist. Update. First off, holy shit, I did not expect my previous post to blow up like that. Thanks for all the awards and DMs. For those asking if this is real, unfortunately, yes. I wish I was creative enough to make this up. So, let me pick up where I left off. Ramon's resume had just landed in my inbox, and I was trying to process the absolute insanity of the situation. The universe had literally handed me the perfect opportunity for payback on a silver fucking platter. I should mention that I usually try to keep things professional at work. Our company culture is pretty chill. We've got a ping-pong table we never use, and free snacks nobody touches. But I've always been adamant about leaving personal shit at the door. Work is work. Family is family. The two shouldn't mix. But this was different. The morning after discovering Ramon's application, I couldn't focus on anything. My apartment's AC was acting up again, making this annoying clicking sound every 10 minutes, and I had a pile of dishes in the sink from 3 days of Uber Eats. But none of that mattered. All I could think about was Ramon's smug face at Thanksgiving and how it would look when he realized who he'd be interviewing with. I opened his resume again and really dug into it. The more I read, the more I noticed little embellishments. He claimed to have led projects he was barely involved in, listed skills that seemed exaggerated based on what I knew about his actual experience. The kind of resume padding everyone does, but taken to another level. Then I did something I probably shouldn't have. I called up an old colleague who worked at Ramon's previous company. Didn't mention Ramon specifically, just caught up and casually asked about their recent layoffs. According to my contact, they hadn't laid off anyone with real talent or leadership potential. The cuts were strategic, removing the middle managers who talked big but delivered little. Interesting. I also scrolled through Ramon's Instagram, which had shifted dramatically from luxury vacation pics and expensive restaurant check-ins to vague motivational quotes and throwback photos. Classic, pretending everything's fine while my life falls apart social media behavior. His LinkedIn was equally revealing. He'd gone from posting humble brags about his achievements to desperately engaging with every recruiter post he could find. Look, I know what it's like to be unemployed and desperate, Back when I was starting out, I lived on ramen and slept on a mattress on the floor for 8 months. I get it. But Ramon? Ramon had spent years making sure everyone knew how much better he was doing than everyone else, how much more successful he was, how much wiser his career choices had been. And now here he was, applying to work for me, the cousin he'd openly mocked for driving an old car. I set up a meeting with Danielle, our HR director. She's scary efficient and doesn't take shit from anyone, including me. When I told her I wanted to handle Ramon's interview personally, she gave me that look, the one that says, "You're being an idiot," without actually saying it. I explained that Ramon was my cousin, expecting her to tell me to recuse myself immediately. Instead, she asked why I hadn't mentioned it sooner. Then she pulled up his application again and asked if he was qualified. I admitted that on paper, he had the skills we needed. The professional thing would be to have someone else handle his application. The right thing would be to come clean about our relationship. But as Danielle pulled up the interview schedule, something inside me just hardened. I remembered every condescending comment, every dismissive look, every time Ramon had subtly put me down in front of others. I told Danielle I wanted to interview him myself, but anonymously. I expected pushback, but she just nodded slowly. She asked if there was bad blood between us, and I gave her the TLDR version of Thanksgiving. Something shifted in her expression. She'd dealt with her fair share of entitled assholes. She agreed to schedule him, but suggested we make it a panel interview with her present, to keep things professional. Smart woman. That's why she runs HR. For the next week, I went back and forth between feeling justified and feeling like an absolute psychopath. I'd wake up at 3 a.m. wondering if I was taking things too far. Then I'd remember Ramon's words, "You can't even afford a new car, and you're giving career advice?" And the doubt would vanish. The night before the interview, I couldn't sleep. I got up at 4 a.m. and sat on my balcony, watching the sun rise, drinking coffee that tasted like dirt. My mind kept racing through different scenarios. What if Ramon recognized me immediately and called me out? What if he apologized for Thanksgiving? What if he actually impressed me in the interview, despite everything? That last thought made me laugh out loud, startling my neighbor's cat that sometimes visits my balcony. Ramon impressing me would require him to be both competent and humble, a combination I'd never seen from him. I spent the morning preparing questions, real, legitimate interview questions that would test his actual knowledge, not just his ability to bullshit. Questions about handling difficult situations, about times he'd failed, and what he'd learned. Questions that would reveal whether he was as good as his resume claimed or just good at taking credit. Meanwhile, Danielle had emailed him with the interview details. 2 p.m., our office downtown, business casual. She'd been deliberately vague about who he'd be meeting with, just mentioning members of the leadership team. Ramon had responded within minutes, obviously eager. His email was full of the corporate jargon people use when they're trying too hard to sound professional. At noon, I took a shower and changed into what I call my actual adult clothes, dark jeans and a button-up shirt. Nothing fancy. I considered wearing my rattiest t-shirt just to make a point, but decided against it. This wasn't about clothes, it was about respect. As I drove to the office, in my perfectly functional 2011 Honda, I rehearsed what I'd say when Ramon walked in. Should I acknowledge our relationship immediately? Let him squirm for a while first? Pretend I didn't recognize him? The possibilities were endless. I arrived early and set up in our main conference room, the one with the good chairs and the view of the city. Danielle came in with Ramon's printed resume and her tablet. She looked at me with that HR director stare that can make even the most confident person question their life choices. She asked if I was sure about this, if I could keep it professional. I promised I would. Was that a lie? Maybe, but at that moment, I believed it. At 1:50 p.m., my phone buzzed with a text from our receptionist. Ramon had arrived early, of course he had, and was waiting in the lobby. He was wearing a suit and looking nervous but ready to impress. Her words. Danielle left to greet him, giving me a few minutes alone with my thoughts. The conference room suddenly felt too small and too large at the same time. My heart was racing, and I realized my hands were shaking slightly. This wasn't fear. It was anticipation, the kind you feel before opening a gift you've been waiting for. I took out my AirPods and queued up the playlist I listen to when I need to focus. Took a few deep breaths, arranged his resume and my question list neatly on the table. Opened my laptop to the notes I'd made about his application. I could hear footsteps approaching in the hallway. Danielle's distinctive quick pace and another set. Heavier, slower, hesitant. They stopped outside the door. I heard Danielle's voice, too muffled to make out the words. Then a lower voice responding. Ramon's voice. A voice I'd heard making snide comments for years. The door handle turned. This was it. The moment Ramon would walk in and see who was sitting across the interview table. The moment he'd realize that the cousin he'd laughed at for driving an old car was the person who would decide if he got this job. I straightened my back, put on my most neutral expression, and waited. The door swung open. Update 2. Okay, I promised the final part of this saga, so here it is. Sorry for the delay. My router decided to die yesterday, and I had to deal with my ISP's absolutely garbage customer service for 3 hours. But enough about my tech problem. Y'all want to know what happened when Ramon walked into that interview room. So where was I? Right. The door was opening. First thing I noticed was Danielle's face. She had this perfect mask of professional courtesy, but her eyes were darting between Ramon and me like she was watching a tennis match. She'd positioned herself slightly to the side, clipboard in hand, ready to observe whatever shit show was about to unfold. Then there was Ramon. He walked in mid-sentence, something about the impressive office space, when he saw me. The change in his expression was indescribable, like someone had suddenly switched his brain from confident interview mode to blue screen of death. His eyes widened, his mouth froze mid-word, and he actually took a small step backward. For about 5 seconds, which felt like 5 hours, nobody said anything. The only sound was the humming of the AC and someone's phone vibrating on the conference table. I broke the silence first, not with anger or accusation, but with the most neutral, professional tone I could muster. I welcomed him to the interview, gestured for him to take a seat, and asked if he'd like some water. Basic interview shit. Acting like this was completely normal. Ramon's face went through about 17 different expressions in 3 seconds. Shock, confusion, embarrassment, fear, then, most interesting of all, anger. Like somehow I had tricked him. He sat down, still staring at me like I was a ghost. His expensive watch, the one he'd made sure everyone noticed at family gatherings, kept catching the light as his hand trembled slightly. His suit was nice, but had that slightly too tight look of someone who'd bought it when they were in better shape. Look, I'd rehearsed this moment a dozen times in my head. I had all these clever lines prepared, but when it actually happened, I went with something simpler. I told him I was surprised to see his application, especially given his comments at Thanksgiving about my career advice not being worth taking. The color drained from his face. He started stammering about how that was just a joke, how he didn't mean anything by it, how everyone was just having fun. Everyone except me. Danielle, bless her, was taking notes with the intensity of someone documenting a rare scientific phenomenon. She'd known something was up, but I don't think she'd anticipated this level of drama. I decided to keep things professional, at least on the surface. We had a real position to fill, and I had prepared real interview questions, so I started asking them. The thing is, these weren't softball questions. These were the kind of technical, in-depth questions that reveal whether someone actually knows their shit or it is just good at talking about knowing their shit. For each question, I referenced specific claims on his resume. That project he claimed to have led? I asked for specific metrics on its success. Those team management skills he highlighted? I asked for examples of how he handled conflict within his team. That expertise in the exact systems we use? I asked him to walk me through how he'd approach a specific problem we'd recently solved. With each question, his confidence crumbled a little more. He'd start answering confidently, then realize he didn't actually know what he was talking about, then try to bullshit his way through. But I knew exactly where the gaps in his knowledge were, and I kept pressing on those spots like a dentist finding a cavity. About 20 minutes in, he was sweating, like visibly sweating through his dress shirt. The AC was cranked to Arctic levels as usual. Our office manager Callie and I have an ongoing thermostat war, but Ramon looked like he'd just run a marathon. I almost felt bad for him. Then I remembered Thanksgiving. I remembered the laughter. I remembered the embarrassment of sitting there while my entire family decided I wasn't successful enough to give advice to a 19-year-old. So I kept going. The worst part for Ramon wasn't even my questions. It was when Danielle started asking hers. She has this way of sounding completely supportive, while asking absolutely devastating follow-ups. She'd validate his partial answer, then ask a question that exposed the holes in it. She wasn't doing it to be cruel. She was genuinely evaluating him as a candidate. But combined with my targeted questions, it was brutal. After 45 minutes, Ramon was a mess. His cool interview persona had completely disintegrated. He'd gone from confidently overselling his experience to desperately trying not to look completely incompetent. That's when I shifted gears. I stopped asking about his resume and started asking about his character. I asked about how he handles situations where he doesn't have all the information, about times he'd been wrong and had to admit it, about how he responds to feedback. With each question, I could see him realizing that this wasn't just about the job anymore. This was about who he was as a person, and he was failing that interview too. Finally, I asked the question I'd been waiting to ask. I asked him about a time when he'd misjudged someone and had to reconsider his assumptions. The conference room went silent. Even the AC seemed to hold its breath. Ramon stared at the table, then at me, then back at the table. For a moment, I thought he might actually apologize, might actually acknowledge what he'd done. Instead, he tried to deflect, started talking about some work situation that had nothing to do with anything. Classic Ramon, unable to admit when he'd fucked up. I let him finish his bullshit answer. Then I closed my laptop and told him I had one final question. I asked why he thought I drove a 2011 Honda when I could afford any car I wanted. His face. OMG, his face. It was like watching someone solve a complex equation in real time. The pieces finally connected in his brain, that I wasn't just successful despite my old car, but that my success had nothing to do with what I drove or how I presented myself. Ramon started to say something about priorities and value, clearly trying to save the interview, but it was too late. Way too late. I thanked him for his time and told him we'd be in touch about our decision. Professional to the end. Danielle escorted him out while I sat there, heart pounding, feeling like I'd just run an emotional marathon. When Danielle came back, she closed the door and just stared at me. Then she started slow clapping. Actual slow clapping. She said it was the most educational interview she'd ever witnessed and that Ramon had set a new record for resume exaggeration. The thing is, his resume wasn't complete fiction. He did have skills. He did have experience. He just wasn't as good as he claimed to be. Not even close. We discussed the interview objectively. Despite my personal feelings, we needed to fill the position. Danielle pointed out that while Ramon wasn't qualified for the senior role he'd applied for, he might be able to handle a more junior position, one with significantly less responsibility and significantly less pay. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying the interview in my head. The look on Ramon's face when he saw me. The moment he realized I knew about all his resume lies. The gradual collapse of his confidence as question after question exposed the gap between his claims and reality. It felt good. Not in a warm, fuzzy way, but in a finally some fucking justice way. 2 days later, Ramon texted me. A long paragraph about how sorry he was about Thanksgiving, how he'd been going through some stuff, how he hoped we could move past it. Not a word about the interview or his bullshit resume. Just damage control because he realized I had power over his job prospects. I didn't respond. Instead, I drafted an email with Danielle. We offered Ramon a position, not the one he'd applied for, but an entry-level role with a salary about 40% lower than what he'd been making. The email was perfectly professional, explaining that while he wasn't a match for the senior position, we saw potential for him to grow with the company if he was willing to start at a more appropriate level. Ramon didn't reply for 3 days. Then he accepted the offer. He started last week. His desk is visible from my office. Every morning he comes in wearing clothes that aren't quite as nice as the ones he used to post on Instagram. He drives a used Hyundai now. The Mercedes is gone. He works hard, keeps his head down, and flinches slightly whenever I walk by. He hasn't told any of the family who he works for. I haven't either. It's our little secret. The best part? Young cousin Sergio has been messaging me for more career advice. Apparently word got around that I might know what I'm talking about after all. Karma's a bitch, and sometimes she drives a 2011 Honda Accord.